It was just another ordinary day at the bank, or so it seemed. The sun was shining, the streets were bustling, and inside the polished glass doors of First National Bank, customers waited in line, shuffling paperwork and checking their phones. But in the far corner of the room, something was about to happen that would turn this quiet afternoon into a moment no one would ever forget. An elderly black woman, Mrs. Evelyn Carter, stood patiently at the counter, her hands clutching a worn leather purse. She had come to resolve a simple issue with her account, something she'd done countless times before. But today, the bank manager, a man in a crisp suit and a stern expression, had other plans. His tone was sharp, his words cutting, and the way he spoke to her made everyone in the room uncomfortable. It wasn't just about the account anymore. It was about respect, dignity, and the way some people treat others when they think no one is watching. Mrs. Carter, a woman in her late 70s, had always been the kind of person who carried herself with grace. She'd raised 3 children, worked hard her entire life, and never asked for much. But as the manager's voice grew louder, her shoulders slumped, and her eyes dropped to the floor. The other customers exchanged uneasy glances, but no one said a word. It was one of those moments where everyone freezes, unsure of what to do or how to help. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, the door swung open. A tall, broad-shouldered man walked in, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Mrs. Carter. It was her son, Marcus. He hadn't planned on stopping by the bank that day, but something, call it intuition, call it luck, had brought him there. And what he walked into was a scene that would make his blood boil. Marcus had always been protective of his mother. Growing up, he'd watched her sacrifice everything to give her family a better life. She was his hero, his rock, and seeing her treated with such blatant disrespect was more than he could take. His jaw tightened as he approached the counter, his presence immediately shifting the energy in the room. The manager, still mid-sentence, paused and looked up, sensing the change. But it was too late. Marcus was already standing beside his mother, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The manager hesitated, his confidence wavering for the first time. He tried to explain, but his words came out jumbled, defensive. Marcus listened, his eyes never leaving the man's face. And then, without warning, he did something no one expected. The room held its breath as Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He opened the camera app, hit record and pointed it at the manager. "Say that again," he said, his tone steady but laced with challenge. "Say it to the camera." The manager froze, his face turning pale. He glanced around as if hoping someone would intervene, but the other customers were silent, their eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before them. Mrs. Carter, still standing beside her son, looked up at him with a mixture of pride and worry. She knew Marcus wasn't one to back down, but she also knew how quickly things could escalate. The tension in the room was palpable, like a storm about to break. And then, just as the manager opened his mouth to respond, the bank's security guard stepped forward, his hand resting on his belt. "Sir," he said, addressing Marcus, "I'm going to have to ask you to put the phone away." Marcus didn't flinch. He kept the camera rolling, his gaze locked on the manager. "Why?" he asked. "What are you afraid of?" The security guard hesitated, unsure of how to handle the situation. Behind him, the other customers began to murmur, their whispers filling the room like a low hum. Some pulled out their own phones, recording the scene from different angles. Others edged closer, drawn by the drama, but unsure of how it would end. The manager, now visibly sweating, tried to regain control, but his authority had already crumbled. And then, just as it seemed like things couldn't get any more intense, Mrs. Carter spoke. Her voice was soft but clear, cutting through the noise like a knife. "Marcus," she said, placing a hand on his arm. "Let's just go. It's not worth it." But Marcus wasn't ready to leave, not yet. He looked down at his mother, his expression softening for a moment before turning back to the manager. "No," he said. "This isn't just about you. This is about how you treat people. And today, you're going to answer for it." The room fell silent again, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The manager opened his mouth to respond, But before he could say anything, the bank's regional director walked in, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. She took one look at the scene and immediately knew something was wrong. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice sharp and authoritative. The manager tried to explain, but his words came out rushed and defensive. The director listened, her expression growing darker with every word. And then, without warning, she turned to Marcus and Mrs. Carter. "I'm so sorry," she said, her tone sincere. "This is not how we do business. Let's step into my office and resolve this." But Marcus wasn't ready to let it go. He looked at the director, then back at the manager, his eyes narrowing. "No," he said. "This doesn't end behind closed doors. This ends right here, right now." The director hesitated, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. The other customers watched, their phones still recording, their eyes wide with anticipation. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, the manager did something no one expected. He stepped forward, his face pale but determined, and began to speak. But what he said next would change everything. The room held its breath, waiting for his words. But before he could finish, Marcus interrupted him, his voice cutting through the silence like a thunderclap. "Enough," he said. "You've said enough." And with that, the scene exploded into chaos. The security guard stepped forward. The director tried to intervene, and the other customers began to shout, their voices blending into a cacophony of anger and confusion. Mrs. Carter stood in the middle of it all, her eyes wide with fear and disbelief. Marcus, still holding his phone, turned to her and said, "Mom, we're leaving." But as they turned to go, the manager shouted after them, his voice desperate now. "Wait, you don't understand." But Marcus didn't stop. He kept walking, his hand firmly on his mother's arm, his mind racing with what to do next. The cool Dector swung shut behind them, leaving the bank in stunned silence. But the story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning, and what happened next would shock everyone, even Marcus. As Marcus and Mrs. Carter stepped out of the bank and into the bright afternoon sunlight, the weight of what had just happened began to settle in. The air outside felt different, charged, like the calm before a storm. Marcus kept his arm around his mother, guiding her gently but firmly toward his car. He could feel her trembling, though she tried to hide it. She had always been strong, the kind of woman who carried the world on her shoulders without complaint. But today, something had shifted. The way that manager had spoken to her, the way he'd looked at her, it wasn't just about the bank account. It was about something deeper, something uglier, and Marcus couldn't let it go. "Mom," he said softly as they reached the car, "are you okay?" Mrs. Carter nodded, but her eyes told a different story. They were filled with a mix of emotions, hurt, anger, and something else Marcus couldn't quite place. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she just shook her head and climbed into the passenger seat. Marcus hesitated for a moment, his hand resting on the car door. He wanted to say something, to reassure her. But he didn't. Nowhere to start. So he just closed the door gently and walked around to the driver's side. As he slid into the seat and started the engine, his mind was racing. What had just happened in that bank? And more importantly, what was he going to do about it? The drive home was quiet. The only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of Mrs. Carter's purse as she fidgeted with it. Marcus kept glancing at her, trying to read her expression. But she was staring out the window, her face unreadable. He wanted to ask her more about what had happened before he arrived, but he didn't want to push her. She'd been through enough already. Instead, he focused on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. His mind kept replaying the scene in the bank, the manager's smug expression, the way he'd talked down to his mother, the way everyone else had just stood there, silent. It made his blood boil, but it also made him think. Why had the manager acted that way? Was it just because she was an elderly black woman? Or was there something more going on? When they finally pulled into the driveway of Mrs. Carter's small, neatly kept house, Marcus turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, staring at the steering wheel. He knew he needed to talk to his mother, to figure out what had really happened. But he also knew he needed to be careful. She was proud, and she didn't like to feel like a burden. So he took a deep breath and turned to her. "Mom," he said gently, "can we talk about what happened back there?" Mrs. Carter hesitated, then nodded slowly. I don't understand why he treated me like that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been a customer at that bank for over 20 years. I've never caused any trouble. I just wanted to fix a mistake on my account. But he acted like I was nothing." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. He reached over and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You're not nothing, Mom," he said firmly. "You're everything. I'm not going to let anyone treat you like that." Mrs. Carter looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "I know, baby," she said, "but I don't want you to get into trouble because of me. That man, he's powerful. He could make things difficult for you." Marcus shook his head. "I don't care about that," he said. "What I care about is making sure you're treated with respect. And if that means taking on the whole bank, then that's what I'll do." They sat there in silence for a few moments, the weight of the situation hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Mrs. Carter sighed and opened the car door. "Let's go inside," she said. "I'll make us some tea, and we can talk." Marcus nodded and followed her into the house. As they walked through the front door, he couldn't help but notice how small and fragile she seemed. It was a stark contrast to the strong, confident woman he'd always known. It made him even more determined to get to the bottom of what had happened. Inside, Mrs. Carter busied herself in the kitchen, filling the kettle with water and setting it on the stove. Marcus sat at the kitchen table watching her. He wanted to help, but he knew she needed to keep her hands busy. It was her way of coping. As she moved around the kitchen, she began to talk, her voice soft but steady. "It started a few weeks ago," she said. "I noticed a charge on my account that didn't make sense. It was only a small amount, but I wanted to get it fixed. So I went to the bank and talked to one of the tellers. She said she'd look into it, but nothing happened. So I went back. And that's when I met him." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes fixed on her. "The manager?" he asked. Mrs. Carter nodded. "Yes, he said he'd handle it personally. But every time I went back, he had a new excuse. He said the system was down, or he needed more information, or he was waiting on approval from someone higher up. And then today he just snapped. He said I was wasting his time, that I was being difficult. He said if I didn't like the way things were done, maybe I should take my business elsewhere." She paused, her hands trembling as she poured the hot water into the teapot. "I didn't know what to do. I just stood there trying to keep my composure. But inside I felt so small." Marcus felt a surge of anger, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Did anyone else hear him?" he asked. Mrs. Carter nodded. "Yes, there were other customers there, but no one said anything. They just looked away." Marcus clenched his fists under the table. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. How could people just stand by and let something like that happen? But then he remembered the way he'd felt when he walked into the bank, the way everyone had frozen, unsure of what to do. It was easy to judge, but he knew it wasn't that simple. Still, it didn't make it right. As they sipped their tea, Marcus's mind was racing. He knew he needed to do something, but he wasn't sure what. He thought about the video he'd recorded on his phone. It wasn't much, but it was something. Maybe he could use it to hold the manager accountable. But he also knew that going up against a bank wasn't going to be easy. They had lawyers, resources, power, and he was just one man. But he couldn't let that stop him, not when it came to his mother. "Mom," he said finally, "I'm going to make this right. I don't know how yet, but I will. I promise." Mrs. Carter looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and worry. "I know you will, baby," she said. "But please, be careful. I don't want you to get hurt." Marcus nodded. "I will," he said. "But I'm not going to let this go. Not until you get the respect you deserve." As they sat there in the quiet kitchen, the tension between them began to ease. But Marcus knew this was far from over. The manager's words, the way he'd treated his mother, it wasn't just about one bad day at the bank. It was about something bigger, something deeper. And Marcus was determined to uncover the truth, no matter where it led. But as he thought about what lay ahead, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The real fight was still to come. And it was going to be a lot harder than he'd ever imagined. Little did he know, the manager had his own secrets. Secrets that could change everything. And as Marcus prepared to take on the bank, he had no idea what he was about to uncover. The stakes were higher than he realized, and the consequences could be far more dangerous than he'd ever anticipated. But for now, all he could do was focus on his mother, on making sure she was okay. The rest would have to wait. But not for long, because the truth had a way of coming out no matter how hard someone tried to bury it. And when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, Marcus woke up with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The events of the previous day were still fresh in his mind, replaying like a broken record. He couldn't shake the image of his mother's face, the hurt, the humiliation, the quiet strength she'd shown even when the world seemed to be against her. He knew he couldn't let this go. Not just for her, but for anyone who had ever been treated unfairly, because of who they were. As he got dressed, his mind raced with possibilities. He needed a plan, something more than just a video on his phone. He needed evidence, witnesses, something concrete that would make the bank take notice. But as he sat down at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, he realized he wasn't even sure where to start. The bank was a powerful institution, and the manager had seemed confident, almost arrogant in his behavior. Marcus wondered if this was a pattern, if other people had been treated the same way. He pulled out his laptop and began searching for any complaints or reviews about the bank, specifically about the manager. It didn't take long for him to find a few threads on local community forums. People had posted about similar experiences. Long waits, unexplained fees, dismissive attitudes from staff. But what caught his attention was a comment from someone who mentioned the manager by name. "He's rude, condescending, and seems to have it out for certain customers," the post read. "I've seen him target elderly people and people of color. It's like he gets off on making them feel small." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just about his mother. This was bigger. He clicked through more posts, his anger growing with each one. There were stories of people being denied loans for no reason, of accounts being frozen without explanation, of customers being talked down to and belittled. It was like the manager had a playbook for how to make people feel powerless. And yet, no one had done anything about it. Marcus wondered why. Was it because people were afraid? Or was it because they didn't think anyone would listen? As he was scrolling through the forums, his phone buzzed. It was a text from his sister, Tamara. "Hey, heard what happened with Mom. You okay?" Marcus sighed and typed back, "I'm fine. Just trying to figure out what to do next." Tamara's response came quickly. "Be careful, Marcus. Banks have a lot of power. You don't want to mess with the wrong people." Marcus knew she was right, but he couldn't just sit back and do nothing. He texted her back, "I know, but I can't let this slide. Not after what they did to Mom." Tamara didn't respond right away, and Marcus could almost feel her hesitation through the phone. Finally, she wrote, "Just be smart about it, okay, and let me know if you need help." Marcus put his phone down and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He knew Tamara was worried, and he didn't blame her. This wasn't just about standing up to a bank manager. It was about taking on a system that had been rigged against people like them for generations. But Marcus wasn't naive. He knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed allies, people who had been through the same thing and were willing to fight back. He thought about the other customers in the bank, the ones who had stood by silently, while his mother was humiliated. Were they too afraid to speak up? Or were they just waiting for someone to take the first step? Later that afternoon, Marcus decided to visit his mother again. He wanted to check on her to make sure she was holding up okay. When he arrived, she was in the garden, tending to her roses. She looked up as he approached, her face lighting up. With a smile. "Hey, baby," she said, brushing dirt off her hands. "What brings you by?" Marcus hugged her tightly, feeling the warmth of her presence. "Just wanted to see how you're doing," he said. Mrs. Carter nodded, her smile fading slightly. "I'm okay," she said. "Just trying to keep busy, you know how I am." Marcus nodded. He did know. His mother had always been the type to bury her feelings in work, to keep moving forward no matter what. But he could see the strain in her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her gardening tools. "Mom," he said gently, "I've been doing some research. And I think what happened at the bank, it's not just about you. Other people have been treated the same way, by the same manager." Mrs. Carter looked at him, her expression unreadable. "What are you saying, Marcus?" she asked. "I'm saying I want to do something about it," he replied. "I want to hold him accountable, but I need your help." Mrs. Carter sighed and sat down on the garden bench, patting the spot next to her. Marcus sat down, feeling the weight of her gaze. "Marcus," she said softly, "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but this is bigger than us. You don't know what you're up against." Marcus nodded. He knew she was right, but he also knew he couldn't back down. Not now. "I know it's risky," he said, "but if we don't do something, nothing will ever change, and I can't live with that." Mrs. Carter looked at him for a long moment, her eyes filled with a mixture of pride and fear. Finally, she nodded. "Okay," she said. "I'll help you, but we have to be smart about this. We can't just rush in. We need a plan." Marcus felt a surge of relief. He knew his mother was right. They needed to be careful, to think things through. But at least now he wasn't alone. As they sat there in the garden, the sun dipping low in the sky, Marcus began to outline his plan. He wanted to gather more evidence, to talk to other customers who had been mistreated. He wanted to document everything, to build a case that the bank couldn't ignore. Mrs. Carter listened quietly, nodding along. But as Marcus spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she wasn't telling him. Something about the manager, about the bank, about why she seemed so hesitant to fight back. He wanted to ask her, to push her for answers, but he knew better. His mother would tell him when she was ready. For now, all he could do was trust her. But as the days went on, Marcus began to notice little things that made him wonder if there was more to the story than he realized. His mother seemed more distracted than usual, her mind often wandering during their conversations. She would get quiet when the bank was mentioned, her eyes darting away as if she were hiding something. And then there were the phone calls. Marcus would hear her talking in hushed tones late at night, her voice tense and urgent. When he asked her about it, she would brush him off, saying it was nothing. But Marcus wasn't so sure. One evening, as Marcus was leaving his mother's house, he noticed a car parked down the street. It was a sleek, black sedan, the kind that screamed, "Official business." The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see inside, but Marcus could feel eyes on him as he walked to his car. He tried to shake off the feeling, telling himself he was being paranoid. But as he drove away, he couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. The car was still there, its headlights off, just sitting in the shadows. It was then that Marcus realized something. This wasn't just about a bank manager. This was about something much bigger, something much darker. And he was only just beginning to scratch the surface. As he drove home, his mind raced with questions. Who was in that car? Were they watching him? Or were they watching his mother? And why? He thought about the manager's smug expression, the way he'd seemed so confident, so untouchable. Was he connected to something bigger? Something dangerous? Marcus didn't know, but he was determined to find out. Because one thing was clear. This wasn't just a fight for respect. This was a fight for the truth. And the truth, he was starting to realize, was far more complicated and far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The next few days were a whirlwind for Marcus. Everywhere he turned, it felt like the walls were closing in. The black sedan had become a constant presence, always parked just far enough away to avoid suspicion, but close enough to remind him that someone was watching. He tried to shake it off to focus on gathering evidence, but the unease gnawed at him. His mother, too, seemed more on edge than ever. She jumped at every knock on the door, every ring of the phone. When Marcus asked her about it, she brushed him off, saying she was just tired. But he knew better. Something was wrong, something she wasn't telling him. Marcus had started reaching out to other customers who had posted about their experiences with the bank. Most were hesitant to talk, afraid of retaliation, but a few were willing to share their stories. One woman, a single mother named Lisa, told him how the manager had denied her a loan to fix her roof, even though she had perfect credit. He looked me straight in the eye and said I didn't qualify, she said, her voice trembling with anger. But I know it's because I'm a black woman. He didn't even try to hide it. Another man, an elderly veteran named Mr. Thompson, recounted how the manager had frozen his account without warning, leaving him unable to pay his bills. I've been with that bank for 30 years, he said, and this is how they treat me? Like I'm nothing? Each story fueled Marcus's determination, but it also deepened his fear. The more he dug, the more he realized how deep the corruption went. It wasn't just one manager, it was the entire system, and the system was designed to protect itself. He started documenting everything, taking notes, recording conversations, and saving screenshots of online posts. He even reached out to a local journalist, a woman named Carla who had written about corporate misconduct in the past. She agreed to meet with him, but when the day came, she didn't show up. Marcus waited for over an hour, his anxiety growing with each passing minute. Finally, he called her, but the phone went straight to voicemail. It wasn't like her to ghost him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened. That night, Marcus decided to confront his mother. He couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. He needed answers. When he arrived at her house, she was sitting in the living room, staring at the TV but not really watching it. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap and her face was pale. "Mom," he said, sitting down beside her, "we need to talk." Mrs. Carter didn't respond at first. She just kept staring at the TV, her eyes distant. Finally, she turned to him, her expression filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "Marcus," she said softly, "there's something I need to tell you." Before she could continue, there was a loud knock on the door. Both of them froze, their eyes darting to the sound. The knock came again, harder this time, more insistent. Marcus stood up, his heart pounding. "Stay here," he said, walking toward the door. He peered through the peephole and saw two men in suits standing on the porch. They looked official, but something about them set off alarm bells in his head. "Who is it?" he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're with the bank," one of the men replied. "We need to speak with Mrs. Carter." Marcus hesitated. He didn't trust them, but he also knew he couldn't just ignore them. He opened the door a crack, keeping the chain lock in place. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone firm. The man in front, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a cold smile, held up a badge. "We're here to discuss a matter of importance," he said. "It's in Mrs. Carter's best interest to cooperate." Marcus glanced back at his mother, who was now standing in the hallway, her face filled with fear. "Mom," he said, "do you know these men?" She shook her head, but there was something in her eyes, something that told him she wasn't being entirely truthful. Before Marcus could say anything else, the man at the door spoke again. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way," he said, his voice low and threatening. "But either way, we're not leaving without speaking to her." Marcus felt a surge of anger, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You're not talking to her without a lawyer present," he said, slamming the door shut. He turned to his mother, his mind racing. "Mom, what's going on? Who are these people?" Mrs. Carter looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "Marcus," she said, her voice trembling, "I didn't want to tell you this, but I think I messed up. I think I made a mistake." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "What kind of mistake?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Carter took a deep breath, her hands shaking. "A few months ago, I got a call from someone at the bank," she said. "They said there was an issue with my account, that I needed to come in and sign some papers. I didn't think much of it at the time. But when I got there, the manager, he pressured me into signing something. He said it was just a formality, that it would fix the problem. But now I think I signed something I shouldn't have." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "What did you sign, Mom?" he asked, his voice tight with fear. Mrs. Carter shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know," she said. "I didn't read it, I trusted him. And now I think they're using it against me." Marcus's mind was spinning. He didn't know what to do, but he knew one thing. They were in danger. The men at the door, the black sedan, the missing journalist, it was all connected. And it was all leading to something much bigger than he'd ever imagined. As he stood there trying to figure out his next move, his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. The message was short but chilling. "Stop digging, or else." Marcus felt a surge of adrenaline. He knew what this meant. They were being watched, threatened, silenced. But he also knew he couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything. He looked at his mother, her face filled with fear and regret, and made a decision. "We're leaving," he said, grabbing her hand. "Now." Mrs. Carter didn't argue. She just nodded, her eyes wide with fear. Marcus quickly packed a bag for her, his mind racing with plans. They couldn't stay here, it wasn't safe. But as they headed for the back door, he heard a noise outside. The sound of footsteps, of voices. He froze, his heart pounding. They were surrounded. The men from the bank weren't just here to talk. They were here to make sure Marcus and his mother didn't cause any more trouble. Marcus looked at his mother, his mind racing. They were out of options, out of time, but he wasn't going to let them win. Not without a fight. "Mom," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "We're going to get through this, I promise." Mrs. Carter nodded, her grip on his hand tightening. But as they stood there, trapped and terrified, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The real battle was still to come, and it was going to be a fight for their lives. Marcus and his mother stood frozen in the dimly lit hallway, the sound of footsteps growing louder outside. The back door was their only way out, but it was clear they weren't alone. Marcus's mind raced, trying to think of a plan. He couldn't risk opening the door and walking straight into whoever was out there. His mother's grip on his hand tightened, her breathing shallow and quick. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What are we going to do?" He didn't have an answer, but he knew they couldn't stay there. The men at the front door would eventually force their way in, and the ones outside would cut off any escape. Just as Marcus was about to make a move, his phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen, expecting another threatening message, but this time it was a call from Carla, the journalist who had stood him up earlier. His heart leapt. Maybe she had a way to help. He answered quickly, keeping his voice low. "Carla, where are you? I thought something happened to you." Her voice was urgent, almost frantic. "Marcus, listen to me. You're in danger. Those men at your mom's house, they're not just from the bank. They're connected to something much bigger. I tried to warn you earlier, but they were watching me too. I had to lay low." Marcus's stomach churned. "What are you talking about? What's going on?" Carla hesitated, then said, "The bank manager you've been dealing with, he's not just some arrogant guy. He's tied to a network of people who've been laundering money through the bank. Your mom's account, the papers she signed, it's all part of it. They've been using her and others like her to cover their tracks. And now that you're digging into it, they see you as a threat." Marcus felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. This wasn't just about disrespect or discrimination. This was about corruption on a scale he couldn't even imagine. Before he could respond, Carla continued, her voice urgent. "You need to get out of there, Marcus, now. They're not going to let you expose this. They'll do whatever it takes to silence you." Marcus glanced at his mother, who was watching. him with wide, fearful eyes. "We're trying," he said, "but they're outside, both doors, we're trapped." Carla was silent for a moment, then said, "There's a basement, right, with a window?" Marcus nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Yeah, but it's small. We'd have to crawl out." "Do it," Carla said. "I'll call someone. To meet you on the other side. Just get out of there." Marcus didn't waste another second. He grabbed his mother's hand and led her toward the basement stairs. The old wooden steps creaked under their weight, and the air grew damp and cold as they descended. The basement was cluttered with boxes and old furniture, but Marcus knew exactly where the window was. He pushed aside a stack of dusty bins and helped his mother climb onto an old workbench. "You'll have to go first, Mom," he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "I'll be right behind you." Mrs. Carter nodded, her face pale but determined. She pushed the window open, the hinges squeaking loudly, and began to crawl through. Marcus held his breath, praying no one outside would hear. Just as his mother slipped through the window, Marcus heard a loud crash from upstairs. The men had broken in. His heart pounded as he climbed onto the workbench and squeezed through the window, scraping his arms on the frame. He dropped to the ground outside, landing hard on the grass. His mother was already on her feet, her eyes darting around the dark backyard. "This way," Marcus whispered, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the side of the house. They moved quickly but quietly, staying in the shadows as they made their way to the front of the property. As they rounded the corner, Marcus saw a car idling at the curb. His first instinct was to run the other way, but then the driver's side window rolled down, and a familiar face peered out. It was Tamara, his sister. "Get in!" she hissed, her eyes wide with panic. Marcus didn't hesitate. He helped his mother into the back seat and climbed in after her. Tamara hit the gas before the doors were even fully closed, the tires squealing, as they sped down the street. "What's going on?" she demanded, glancing at Marcus in the rearview mirror. "Why are there men at Mom's house? And why did Carla call me and tell me to come get you?" Marcus took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "It's a long story," he said. "But the short version is we're in way over our heads. The bank manager, he's involved in something illegal. Money laundering, maybe worse. And now they're after us because we know too much." Tamara's face went pale. "Are you serious, Mom? What did you get yourself into?" Mrs. Carter shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't know what I was signing. I just wanted to fix my account." Tamara glanced at Marcus again, her expression a mix of fear and determination. "Okay," she said, "we'll figure this out, but we need to go somewhere safe, somewhere they can't find us." Marcus nodded, his mind racing. "Carla said she'd send someone to help us. Maybe we should wait for her." Tamara shook her head. "We can't trust anyone right now. Not until we know who's on our side." She turned down a side street, her eyes darting to the mirrors, to make sure they weren't being followed. "I know a place," she said. "It's not much, but it's off the grid. We can lay low there until we figure out what to do." As they drove, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every car that passed seemed suspicious. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. He kept glancing out the window, his heart pounding in his chest. His mother sat quietly in the back seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked smaller somehow, like the weight of everything had crushed her spirit. Marcus reached over and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "We're going to get through this, Mom," he said. "I promise." She nodded, but her eyes were filled with doubt. When they finally reached Tamara's safe house, a small, run-down cabin on the edge of town, Marcus felt a small sense of relief. But it didn't last long. As they got out of the car, his phone buzzed again. It was another message from the unknown number. This time, it was a photo of Carla tied to a chair, her face bruised and bloodied. The message underneath was short and chilling. "You're next." Marcus felt a surge of anger and fear. They weren't just being watched, they were being hunted. And now, Carla was in danger because of him. He showed the photo to Tamara, her face going pale as she realized what it meant. "We have to help her," Marcus said, his voice tight with desperation. We can't just leave her like this. Tamara shook her head. Marcus, we can't. If we go after her, we're walking right into their trap. We need to think this through. But Marcus wasn't sure they had time to think. Every second they waited, Carla's life was in more danger. And if they didn't act soon, they might be too late. As they stood there in the cold night air, the weight of the situation pressing down on them, Marcus knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about exposing the bank anymore. This was about survival, and the stakes had never been higher. Marcus stared at the photo of Carla on his phone, his hands trembling with a mix of rage and fear. The bruises on her face, the fear in her eyes. It was all because of him. Because he had pushed too hard, dug too deep. Tamara was right, going after Carla was a trap. But he couldn't just leave her there. He couldn't live with himself if something happened to her because of his choices. His mother sat quietly on the couch in the cabin, her face pale and drawn. She hadn't said much since they arrived, but the guilt in her eyes was unmistakable. She blamed herself for all of this, and Marcus knew he had to fix it. Not just for her, but for everyone who had been wronged by the bank. We can't just sit here, Marcus said finally, his voice low but firm. We have to do something. Tamara shook her head, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. And what exactly do you suggest, Marcus? Walk into their hands and get yourself killed? That's not going to help anyone. Marcus clenched his fists, frustration boiling over. Then what? Wait for them to find us here? Wait for them to hurt someone else? I can't do that, Tamara. I won't. His sister sighed, running a hand through her hair. I get it, okay? I do. But we need a plan. We can't just rush in blind. Before Marcus could respond, his phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a photo. It was a video. His stomach dropped as he hit play. Carla was still tied to the chair, but now there was a man standing behind her, his face obscured by a mask. His voice was distorted, cold, and mechanical. You have 1 hour, he said. Come to the address I'm sending you, alone. If you bring anyone else, or if you call the police, she dies, and then we come for your mother. The screen went black, and a moment later, an address popped up on the screen. Marcus felt his chest tighten. They were out of time. Tamara grabbed his arm, her grip tight. Marcus, you can't go. This is exactly what they want. They'll kill you, and then they'll come for us anyway. Marcus pulled away, his jaw set. I don't have a choice, Tamara. I can't let her die because of me. His mother stood up, her voice trembling but firm. Marcus, listen to your sister, please. I can't lose you too. Marcus looked at her, his heart breaking at the fear in her eyes. But he knew what he had to do. I'll be careful, he said, but I have to try. I can't just sit here and do nothing. Tamara stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. Fine, but you're not going alone. Marcus shook his head. They said to come alone if they see you. Tamara cut him off. I'll stay out of sight, but I'm not letting you walk into this by yourself. End of discussion. Marcus wanted to argue, but he knew there was no time. He nodded reluctantly, then turned to his mother. Stay here, he said. Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone but us. Mrs. Carter nodded, tears streaming down her face. Please, be careful, she whispered. Marcus hugged her tightly, then turned and headed for the door. The address led them to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The place looked like it hadn't been used in years, with broken windows and graffiti covering the walls. Marcus parked a few blocks away, his heart pounding as he and Tamara approached on foot. Remember, Tamara whispered, I'll be close, but I'll stay out of sight. If things go south, I'll call for help. Marcus nodded, though he knew calling for help wasn't an option. The men who had taken Carla weren't the kind to be scared off by the police. They were professionals, and they didn't make mistakes. As Marcus stepped inside the warehouse, the dim light from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling revealed Carla tied to a chair in the center of the room. Her head was slumped forward, and for a terrifying moment, Marcus thought he was too late. But then she stirred, lifting her head to look at him. Her face was bruised and swollen, but her eyes were filled with relief. Marcus, she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You shouldn't have come." Before Marcus could respond, a voice echoed through the empty space. "I have to admit, I'm impressed you actually showed up." Marcus turned to see the bank manager stepping out of the shadows, his usual smug expression replaced by something darker, more dangerous. Behind him were two men in suits, their faces hard and unreadable. Marcus felt a surge of anger, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Let her go," he said, his voice steady. "This is between you and me." The manager laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "Oh, it's far bigger than that, Marcus. You've been poking your nose where it doesn't belong, and now you're going to learn what happens when you mess with the wrong people." Marcus took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists. "You think you can just get away with this? With everything you've done? People know about you now. They're not going to let this slide." The manager smirked. "Oh, Marcus, you really don't get it, do you? This isn't just about me. It's about the people I work for, powerful people, and they don't take kindly to being exposed." He nodded to the men behind him, and they stepped forward, their hands reaching for something at their sides. Marcus braced himself, knowing he was outnumbered and outmatched. But he wasn't going down without a fight. Just as the men moved toward him, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse. Marcus turned to see Tamara standing in the doorway, a metal pipe in her hands. She had smashed one of the windows, drawing everyone's attention. "Leave my brother alone!" she shouted, her voice filled with fury. The men hesitated, caught off guard by her sudden appearance. Marcus used the distraction to his advantage, lunging at the closest man and tackling him to the ground. The other man turned to help his partner, but Tamara was already on him, swinging the pipe with all her strength. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Marcus fought with everything he had, his anger and fear fueling his movements. He managed to land. Few solid punches, but the men were trained fighters, and it wasn't long before they gained the upper hand. Marcus found himself pinned to the ground, a knee pressed into his chest as one of the men raised a fist to strike. But before the blow could land, a voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Enough!" Everyone froze. Marcus looked up to see the bank manager holding a gun, the barrel pointed directly at him. His face was twisted with rage, his usual composure completely gone. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" he snarled. "But this ends now." He pulled the trigger, and Marcus braced himself for the impact. But the shot never came. Instead, there was a loud bang, and the manager dropped to the ground, clutching his leg. Marcus turned to see Carla standing behind him, a gun in her hands. Her face was pale, but her hands were steady. "I told you," she said, her voice cold. "You shouldn't have come." The men hesitated, unsure of what to do. But before they could make a move, the sound of sirens filled the air. Tamara had called the police after all. The men exchanged a look, then turned and ran, disappearing into the shadows. Marcus sat up, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Tamara rushed to his side, helping him to his feet. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Marcus nodded, though his body ached from the fight. "I'm fine," he said. "Thanks to you." Carla lowered the gun, her hands trembling now that the adrenaline was fading. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to involve you in this, but I couldn't let them win." Marcus shook his head. "You didn't involve me. I chose to fight, and I'd do it again." He looked down at the bank manager, who was writhing in pain on the ground. "It's over," he said. "You're done." But as the police arrived and began to secure the scene, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. The manager had mentioned powerful people, and Marcus knew this wasn't the end. There were still questions that needed answers, still people who needed to be held accountable. But for now, at least, they were safe. And that was enough. As they walked out of the warehouse, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, Marcus felt a sense of relief he hadn't felt in weeks. But as he glanced at Carla, he noticed something in her expression, something that made him wonder if she knew more than she was letting on. And as the police began to question her, Marcus couldn't help but feel that the real fight was just beginning. The days that followed the showdown at the warehouse were a blur for Marcus. The police had taken the bank manager into custody, and the investigation into the bank's illegal activities was finally underway. Carla had given her statement, detailing everything she knew about the money laundering operation and the powerful people behind it. Marcus and Tamara had done the same, recounting their experiences and providing the evidence they'd gathered. It felt like a victory, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. The manager had been just one piece of a much larger puzzle, and Marcus knew the fight wasn't over yet. As the investigation unfolded, more details began to surface. The bank manager, whose name was revealed to be Richard Grayson, had been working with a network of corrupt officials and business leaders to funnel millions of dollars through the bank. Mrs. Carter's account, along with others, had been used to hide the illegal transactions. The papers she'd signed under pressure had given them access to her funds, allowing them to move money without raising suspicion. It was a sophisticated operation, and it had been going on for years. But thanks to Marcus and Carla, it was finally being exposed. The media picked up the story quickly, and soon it was all over the news. People were outraged, demanding justice for the victims and accountability for those involved. Marcus found himself at the center of it all, giving interviews and speaking out about what had happened. He didn't enjoy the spotlight, but he knew it was important. If his story could help prevent something like this from happening again, then it was worth it. His mother, though still shaken, was proud of him. She had been through so much, but she was finally starting to heal. With the truth out in the open, she no longer had to carry the weight of guilt and fear. Tamara, too, had found a sense of closure. She had always been the practical one, the one who kept Marcus grounded. But this experience had brought them closer than ever. They had fought side by side, and they had come out stronger because of it. "We make a pretty good team," she said one evening as they sat on the porch of their mother's house watching the sunset. Marcus smiled. "Yeah, we do. But let's not make a habit of this, okay? I think I've had enough excitement for a lifetime." Carla, meanwhile, had become something of a hero in the journalism world. Her reporting on the scandal had earned her national recognition, and she was determined to see it through to the end. She had promised Marcus that she wouldn't stop until everyone involved was held accountable. "This is just the beginning," she told him during one of their many conversations. "There are still a lot of questions that need answers. But we'll get there, together." Despite the progress, Marcus couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of unease. The manager had mentioned powerful people, and Marcus knew that not all of them had been caught. Some were still out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. He had seen the way Carla's eyes darkened whenever the subject came up, and he knew she was thinking the same thing. They had won a battle, but the war was far from over. One evening, as Marcus was going through the evidence they'd gathered, he found something that made his blood run cold. It was a list of names of people who had been involved in the operation. Some were familiar, but others were completely unknown. At the top of the list was a name that sent a chill down his spine: Senator Harold Whitmore. Marcus had heard of him before. He was a well-respected politician, known for his tough stance on crime and corruption. But according to the list, he was one of the key players in the money laundering scheme. Marcus couldn't believe it. If someone like Whitmore was involved, then who could they trust? He called Carla immediately, his hands trembling as he held the phone. "You need to see this," he said, his voice urgent. Carla arrived within the hour, her face pale as she read through the list. "This changes everything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If Whitmore is involved, then this goes all the way to the top. We're talking about people with real power, Marcus. People who can make problems disappear." Marcus felt a surge of anger. "We can't let them get away with this," he said. "Not after everything they've done." Carla nodded, her expression grim. "We won't, but we have to be careful. If they find out we have this list, they'll come after us. And this time they won't stop until we're dead. The next few weeks were tense. Marcus and Carla worked tirelessly to verify the information on the list, reaching out to sources and digging through records. It was dangerous work, and they both knew the risks. but they also knew they couldn't back down. Too much was at stake. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they had enough evidence to take the next step. Carla published an explosive article, exposing the full extent of the corruption and naming names. The fallout was immediate. Senator Whitmore and several others were forced to resign, and a federal investigation was launched. It was a victory, but it came at a cost. Marcus and Carla had become targets, and they knew they would never truly be safe. But they also knew they had done the right thing. They had stood up to corruption, and they had made a difference. As Marcus stood on the porch of his mother's house one evening watching the sun set, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in months. It was over. They had won. But as he turned to go inside, he noticed a car parked down the street. It was a sleek black sedan, the kind that screamed official business. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see inside, but Marcus could feel eyes on him. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Was this it? Had they finally come for him? But as he watched, the car slowly pulled away, disappearing into the night. Marcus let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Maybe it was nothing, or maybe it was a reminder that the fight was never really over. As he walked inside, his mother and Tamara were waiting for him, their faces filled with concern. "Everything okay?" Tamara asked, her voice tight with worry. Marcus nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah," he said, "everything's fine." But as he sat down at the kitchen table, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. The battle might have been won, but the war was far from over. And Marcus knew that as long as there were people willing to fight for justice, there would always be hope. The story of Marcus and his mother had become a symbol of resilience and courage. It was a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one person could make a difference. And as Marcus looked at his family, he knew that no matter what happened next, they would face it together. They had been through hell and back, but they had come out stronger because of it. And that was something no one could ever take away from them.